Prime Minister.
Andrew, how are you? Good to see you.
Lovely to see you. Prime Minister, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Well, Julia Gillard knocked back every invitation I gave her in 2 years. Why have you agreed to come on?
Well, Andrew, you talked to a whole bunch of people in Australia that we, the government, need to be talking to as well. So whether it's you, the ABC, 9, 7, other news media, the Australian people have made up of all those groups. And so I've got a responsibility to put out what we believe in, why we believe it, what we're doing about it, our practical achievements in government, where we may have stuffed up, put it all out there, talk to people, they'll make up their own mind.
Talk even to Conservatives.
Exactly. And you wouldn't describe yourself as a Conservative, would you, Andrew?
Absolutely, the only place to be. Prime Minister, in 2008, you scrapped our tough border laws. Now, an Australian Federal Police report compiled around September in that same year warned that people smugglers, and I'm quoting, will market recent changes to Australia's immigration policy to entice potential illegal immigrants. Now, that report was sent to your department in March. Why did you not follow that advice and heed that warning?
Well, the first thing, Andrew, and you would accept this as a Conservative, is that there is a thing called a democracy. We went to the 2007 election with a set of policies, including the abolition of the then Pacific Solution. We obtained a majority. People knew exactly what we were proposing to do, and we did it. Secondly, having formed the government, we received in the subsequent years multitudes of advice from all sorts of different government agencies. I'm not familiar with the one you've just referred to, nor would you logically expect me to be familiar with it if it went to my department. But the bottom line is we observed a change in circumstances over the subsequent years. And as I've said elsewhere, probably around the 9-10 point is where we should have adjusted policy earlier.
I'm saying, though, that that warning was sent to your department in March of 2009, only months later. Again, in 2008, the year you did this, the International Organisation of Migration, the head in Indonesia, warned people smugglers have clearly noted there has been a change in policy and they're testing the envelope. Wasn't scrapping the border laws your most catastrophic mistake?
As I just said before, we operated on the base of the mandate we received from the Australian people in the 2007 election. And had we not done so, you and others would have criticised us for not honouring our word to the Australian people. Secondly, circumstances then changed.
Well, they
and
did change.
I've quite readily admitted that we should have adjusted probably in the period of 9-10 or begun to adjust. And I've got to say 2020 hindsight is easy. And whatever the reports...
That's not hindsight, these were warnings.
One of the reports that you've referred to, or both of them in fact, would have been part of a multitude of reports coming to the government with differing analyses of what was transpiring at the time. And you know as well as I do, if you run a government, you head a government, you don't see all the reports which come in, they're assessed by your agencies, and there would have been many of them.
Well, you're saying that you were doing merely what the voters had asked you to do in 2007.
It's called the democratic mandate.
Well, before the 2007 election, you said Labor's policy is that if people are intercepted on the high seas, then these vessels should be turned around. Maybe the voters expected you to honour that promise.
Well, what we discovered subsequent to the election period and after long consultation with officials is that, and this is the reality which Mr Abbott faces today, is the instruction given to people smugglers out there on the high seas is that if you are about to be turned around by an Australian vessel, go out and sink the boat. And that's precisely the modus operandi which many of them have adopted, and therefore it proves to be an impractical policy. The further thing is this: when the government of Indonesia has made clear its policy that it doesn't accept that proposition of turning back the boats, you run a second risk as well. And I don't think your listeners or viewers would necessarily want a conflict with Indonesia, which could have the capacity of expanding into something broader.
A conflict with Indonesia? I think they've denied that was likely, the Indonesians. But look, now
I think what the Indonesians said, Andrew, was that they opposed unilateral action. Mr Abbott's policy is unilateral action, and that is very clear-cut in various statements, both by the Indonesian president, with myself, in Bogor in Indonesia recently, and subsequently by other ministers of the government.
Aren't the Indonesians unhappy with the unilateral action that you have just taken? making a deal with PNG that they were not warned of?
I spoke today, in fact, or in recent days, with both the Indonesian president and with their foreign minister, long-standing friends of mine. Our Foreign Minister Bob Carr was in very early dialogue with Indonesians about our proposed course of action with the regional resettlement arrangement, as you'd expect between friends and partners. We actually know how to work with our friends and partners in the region in a very complex situation affecting many countries around the world. I think what you've seen in recent days is Mr Abbott not being able to work with Papua New Guinea, given the statements which have been put out by their High Commissioner in Canberra and, in fact, by their Prime Minister in Port Moresby.
Well, can I talk to you about your PNG deal? Now you promise that you will send every boat person to Papua New Guinea. Now, since you've made that threat, boat people have kept arriving. At more than 100 a day, there's been no drop. Doesn't that suggest to you your plan has failed already?
Well, Andrew, as you know from the statement I made only a little over a week ago at the time of announcing the regional resettlement arrangement, I said very openly on day one, number one, don't expect an immediate reduction in boats.
Right, when can we expect that reduction?
Number two is what I said, people smugglers will then seek to test the government's resolve and the
implementation. Testing it. So when will
then seek
we
to
see
test the
this
people's
work?
will then seek to test the government's resolve, and we are not for turning. Our policy is very clear. If you're a people smuggler and you seek to bring people to Australia by boat to Christmas Island, then know this: you will not be settled in Australia. That is the core response to the business model which people smugglers have used around the world for quite a long time in dealing with Australia.
When will we see your policy start to work? Before the election? Will we see fewer boats?
And what I said when I launched the policy with the other ministers, the Attorney General and the Immigration Minister, Tony Burke, a week or so ago, was that we would need to see the implementation of this policy over a period of time and its effect over many months.
So we won't see. What you're saying then is that this may not work before the election, trust you, it will after.
Well, last time I looked, Andrew, I've been Prime Minister of this country for the last 4 weeks. What I've sought to do is address this within the first couple of weeks. I'm just after
a performance man. You're asking people to take you and trust that you will do what you say, your plan will work. I'm asking you, will we see it work before the election?
And what I'm saying to you in response is the appropriate decision by the government is to go to the heart of the business model of people smugglers, which is for them to say to their customers, if you come to Australia with us, then you'll end up being settled in Australia. And what I'm saying in response is that's not going to happen, and you know as well as I do. It is the implementation of that policy direction over time, resolutely, which will yield results. In the interim, people smugglers will test your results.
I've just asked you a fairly simple question.
And I've given you a very direct answer.
No, you haven't.
Absolutely direct and a responsible answer.
Will we see fewer boats before the election?
I've given you a responsible answer. I don't intend...
You don't know.
I am giving you a responsible answer which says the clarity of the government's decision, going to the heart of the people smuggling model, is the right response. Number two, it is the product of the implementation of that over time. And I said on day one, over months. That's what I said. And we'll see...
Well, what you're saying is we won't know before the election if this works. Can you tell me, do you know how much extra this deal will cost us? And if you do know, can you tell us now?
What I've said already, and why you've asked me that question, is that we will make a full statement as to the net impact on budget of the regional resettlement arrangement with Papua New Guinea when the government releases an economic and financial statement prior to the election.
Why is it a secret now? I mean, surely you've costed it. Surely you said, this is what it will cost, let's do it. Why can't you tell us now what it costs?
Well, we'll be absolutely transparent about that, as we have been about every other spending measure.
You're transparent now.
The bottom line is the person who you often support on this program, Tony Abbott, has said in the last week that they won't even adhere to the pre-election fiscal outlook document, which is to make transparent their expenditures and their cuts to budget and services.
I'm asking you to be accountable.
No, I'm asking for a bit of level treatment here, Andrew, and you know that as well as I do.
You realise, Prime Minister, that one thing that Conservatives have about a problem with you is spending lots of money and not getting the result. That's what we say. I know you've got a counter to that. I would like to know, how much are you spending on this deal? And I find it odd that you can't tell me.
Well, let me put it to you in these terms, Andrew, and you said I have a counter to it. You said that Conservatives have a view that the government's expenditures have been ineffective. I'd put it to you as the counterfactual had the government not intervened in the global financial crisis and not undertaken temporary borrowings, what would have happened here is what's happened in every other country in Europe, which is plunging.
This deal, the
no,
PNG
you made,
deal.
Hey, Andrew,
and
be
now you
fair.
segued.
Andrew, no, you segued, and you know perfectly well what you said. You made a general proposition about Conservatives, and I'm responding to that.
For the money on this one.
I know. You put to me a general proposition, and I'm responding by saying we intervened, we borrowed, we prevented the country from going into recession, aided by the activities of Australian business and aided by China, and we avoided mass unemployment. That was the right response. And as for this one, we will account for it in the proper way. And I assume you'll put directly to Mr Abbott when you next interview him, because he chooses often to be interviewed on this program, I assume, is that why has he abandoned the fiscal discipline document put forward for all governments to adhere to by John Howard, your hero, Peter Costello, maybe not your hero, back in 1996. And he's walked away from it because he doesn't want to account the $70 billion worth of black hole in his outlays.
Prime Minister, you promised to terminate the carbon tax, switching it a year earlier from the price set in Europe's emissions trading system. Now, you say this will cut power bills because Europe's price today is $6. But Labor's last budget, and that's 2 months ago only, projects that Europe's price will actually rise over the next 6 years to $38. Not 6, 38. Can you guarantee that we will never pay a carbon price higher than what we pay today?
If you have a floating price, Andrew, and you will understand that, the price changes over time. That's why you have it. It's called a market solution.
So you can't guarantee that we won't one day be paying $38 instead of today, $24.
Andrew, as a good market person yourself, being the strong Conservative that you are, markets function according to supply and demand, and therefore what will happen with a floating price for carbon is it will adjust accordingly over time.
And the Treasury document is right. It will go up in 5 years, say, 6 years, to $38.
The international price will be affected by a whole bunch of factors over time.
That's in your budget.
You've often attacked, for example, the Chinese for not being participants in carbon pricing. Well, lo and behold, the Chinese...
I haven't attacked them. I probably praise them.
No. You know, the Conservatives, well, ultimately, you don't believe in climate change. I do.
That's not true.
Well, hang on.
To say I don't believe in climate change is simply not true.
Well, what is your view on climate change? Because it underpins this argument. I've heard you dismiss the proposition many times.
No, you have not heard me dismiss climate change.
Well, what's your view on climate change? It's pretty fundamental.
I want to ask you about climate change. Well, let's go into it.
I accept the science. It's happening. Therefore,
I'm
we've got to do something
going to quote you
about
science and see whether you accept the science. An IPCC author, Professor Roger Jones, we're talking science, says your carbon policies will at best cut the world's temperature by 4/1000ths of 1 degree by the end of the century. 4/1000ths. Do you seriously think it's worth us spending all this money, these taxes, these programs, to do essentially nothing about the temperature?
The International Panel of Climate Change Scientists that you just referred to contains within it 4,000 scientists. You've just chosen to quote one. Number two is this.
That is the most generous figure.
That is
will
one.
You tell me how much your programs will cut the temperature?
I'm just putting into context. There are 4,000 scientists on that panel. You've just chosen to quote
one.
Here's the second point.
That is the science.
No, that's
Are you denying that figure?
Andrew, you've chosen to select the quote which suits your argument. That's the first point.
Well, you tell me your figure then. All right, if my figure's wrong, you tell me your figure.
No, you've said, here is one selection from a panel of 4,000 scientists, because it happens to accord with the Andrew Bolt view of the world.
No, this is...
It's true. It's absolutely true. The second point is this.
You are misinformed. That is what your programs will do. If you think your programs will cut the temperature by more than 4/1000ths of a degree, tell me now.
Tell me now. When you pronounce that the science says this, you're saying Andrew Bolt's selection of the science says that.
Tell me Kevin Rudd's selection.
The second point is this.
Tell me Kevin Rudd's figure.
I'm about to answer if you'd allow me the opportunity.
All right, let's hear the figure then.
No, the opportunity that I would take is simply this. When you implement an action on carbon pricing as a nation like Australia, and you represent less than 2% of global emissions, and you make an undertaking to reduce your carbon emissions over time, the way in which it works globally is to work in partnership with countries and economies around the world.
That would lower the temperature by the end of the century to 1/10 of a degree. I'm
That's
just
according
asking you,
to
can I
that's
ask
according
you
to
more
your
science?
No, it's according
More
to your
science.
selection of the science.
No, that's IPC science.
No, it's the
One more
Andrew
question on
Bolt
the
selection
science.
of 1 of 4,000
Well,
scientists.
as soon as I hear Kevin Rudd's selection of the science, I'll be impressed.
Well, the science says
I'll
that
be impressed.
the
Here
science
is
says
the
that you
science.
actually act in concert with other economies. And
just
if
gave you the figure.
your argument is that if Australia bows out and does nothing, that therefore all economies around the world would simply say, well, we have a responsibility,
ask you
but they
about the
don't.
science.
We're
Do you
all in this
accept-
together. It's one planet.
Another IPC scientist, Hans van Storch, I'm sure you've heard of him, very prominent, has said that there's been essentially no warming for 15 years. In another 5 years, if there's no more warming, he'll have to reconsider the global warming theory. Will you reconsider your adherence to global warming theory if there is no more warming for another 5 years?
There are two sources of authority that we should listen to because we pay them for their best and considered advice. One is the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists.
I've just quoted one.
Yeah, you just quoted one of
A very
4,000.
prominent
A very selective quote.
I'm asking you, do you
And the second point is
accept
this: the second source
what will
of
make
authority.
you change your
the second
mind?
source of authority is the Prime Minister of Australia, is the CSIRO, and the CSIRO, which is a body which has existed in this country since the 1930s, analyses climate change science. Their conclusion is that not only does it exist, but the consequences for Australia of us and the world not acting is that you will see an increase in extreme weather events, and then you will see an increase in droughted events across southeastern and
They're
southwestern
snowing you,
Australia.
Prime Minister. They are snowing you.
Says Andrew Bolt, the climate change scientist.
Remember how we were going to have a permanent
climate change scientist equals, in your case, skeptic equals denier. And you know
remember how we were going to have a permanent drought and it would never rain again and the dams would
you
empty?
said earlier in this interview,
You believe
Andrew.
that?
You said earlier in this interview, Andrew, that you did not dismiss climate change
I don't.
occurring.
The climate changes.
You have just said in this interview that no change is occurring, and it won't. That's what
I didn't
you've said.
say it won't occur. I never said that. And if I had,
So,
I'd know.
last
question, Prime
therefore,
Minister.
what's your view on climate change?
Last question, Prime Minister.
I think your listeners, your viewers, deserve to know whether you believe it
Why don't we
exists or
come
not.
back and have a whole program on this? I'd love to do it. Prime Minister, to finish on, in 2007, Labor under you promised to turn back the boats. It promised to stop reckless spending. In 2010, Julia Gillard promised no carbon tax and a budget surplus this year. All those promises and a lot more were broken. What are you going to do to make people trust your promises now?
The first thing I'd say is that climate change, building on where we've just been in this discussion, is real. It requires action called putting a price on carbon. What I put forward was a floating price way back when, rejected by an ungodly cabal of the Liberals and the Greens. And subsequently, Julia Gillard at the beginning of the last parliamentary term, or this
No,
parliamentary
I'm not
term.
asking you to justify the promise. I'm asking you about how you go about rebuilding trust.
Because if you're engaged in a discussion about trust, understanding is important in terms of how we've arrived at, where we've arrived at. I believe in climate change, you don't.
I do.
Well, actually,
you keep misstating it, but you keep going.
Well, you've never explained to anybody why you believe it and
I've
what you think should be
written
done.
many articles. I'll send the best 10 to you.
Well, why don't you? Secondly, in terms of our action on climate change, I've been clear-cut from day one. A floating price is the best way. That was rejected by the Liberals and the Greens, despite the fact it was the least expensive way to go. Number two, on the question of asylum seekers that you raised, we have had to adjust our policy over time, and I make absolutely no apology whatsoever for our current policy settings because the world around us has changed. And number three, you spoke about expenditure disciplines. I would simply go back to the point, Andrew, that within 9 months of having been elected, the global financial crisis erupts, the largest economic crisis the world has seen since the Great Depression, from which many economies in the world have yet to recover. We actually invested, we borrowed to do that, and the result was not only do we have new modern facilities in schools around Australia, but we didn't go into recession, we don't have mass unemployment, and we have among the lowest debt and deficit levels in the world with a AAA credit rating, despite what Mr Abbott may say on your program.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you didn't regret it.
No, I'm happy to come back.